Have you ever been called a burden by your own family? In the very place where one day they promised you love and shelter? I was. And worse, the one who said it was my own son, the one I carried in my arms and helped raise, even when he didn't ask for help. I was there, and what I discovered afterward, no one in my family was prepared to face. Imagine spending decades silently footing every bill, water, electricity, elevator repairs, without ever asking for anything in return. And one day, hearing that you're just a nuisance who doesn't contribute anything. It was in that silence that something inside me awoke. Today, I'm going to show you how a forgotten signature on an old contract became my greatest weapon, and you'll understand how to protect what you built before they try to erase you from your own story. Every second counts, because if you ignore what I'm about to tell you, you could end up erased by those you loved most. Stay with me until the end, and find out what happened the day the bank revealed something that even my son didn't have the courage to face. You won't believe what I did when I finally reclaimed what was mine. My name is Teresa Aguilar. I'm 71 years old, and I live in Valparaiso, Chile. This happened on a cold August morning, on the third floor of an old building I know better than the palm of my hand. That day began like any other. Black tea with lemon, 2 oatmeal cookies, and my routine of watering my balcony plants, as I've done since the 1980s. If someone had told me then that I would hear something that would change my existence in that place, I would have laughed sweetly, because I thought nothing could shake me. I've been a widow for 15 years, and since Enrique passed, I've continued living in the same building where we raised our children. Enrique was one of those men who rarely spoke, but when he did, he put everything in order. He worked in labor law, and it was precisely thanks to a settlement he won in a lawsuit against a bank that we were able to buy the building. But few know that. At the time, we put everything in my name, a silent agreement between us, made on an evening scented with hot soup and old paperwork. Mauricio, my eldest son, lives on the first floor with his wife and their 2 boys. I've always been a present mother, but after he married, our bond cooled. Even so, I help as much as I can. I pay part of the building's expenses, contribute to cleaning the lobby, give the grandkids some money. From time to time, I never complained, never demanded recognition. I thought love would be enough. But that day, love seemed so small in the face of the phrase I heard behind the laundry room door. I had gone downstairs to return the superintendent's cleaning bucket and ended up passing by my son's apartment door. It was ajar. I heard low but tense voices. Daniela, my daughter-in-law, was saying something about having to cut expenses. And then came the phrase that made my stomach freeze. My mom doesn't contribute anything anymore. She's a financial burden. My world stopped. I stood there, motionless, as if someone had erased my existence with an eraser. I don't know how long I stayed listening to the echo of those words. They seemed to come from somewhere much deeper than their living room. I descended the stairs as if my bones had doubled in age. Each step felt like a silent stab. I entered my apartment without making a sound, sat on the edge of the bed, and looked at my worn, woolen socks. I felt ridiculous. How could I be there, keeping silent, baking corn muffins for the grandchildren while being seen as a burden? I never imagined I would hear something like that from someone I helped bring into the world, but there was something even more painful. He was wrong. Mauricio had no idea that this building only existed because his father and I gave up everything we had to buy it. I hadn't told anyone, not even after Enrique died. I thought preserving family peace was worth more than a deed with a stamp. But maybe I was wrong. Maybe silence, instead of protecting, had erased my presence. That morning, I understood that it was time to decide. Either I remained invisible, or I put my name back where it always belonged, even if no one else knew. Fate, however, decided to act before I did. That very afternoon, I received a letter from the bank. The mail was addressed to me, but they left it in the concierge's box. A neighbor brought it to me. It was a notice about updating the registration of the properties under my name. And there it was, the entire building. Registration number, property tax details, everything. It wasn't just a piece of paper. It was a silent reminder that I was still here, and that yes, I was the owner of that building. I took a deep breath. For the first time in years, I felt something inside me stir. It wasn't anger. It was something else. a kind of ancient resolve I didn't even remember I had. I sat at the kitchen table, opened the letter again, and read every line as if reading a will left by courage itself. I had no more doubts. From that moment on, I would stop asking permission to exist. I stored the letter in a blue folder hidden at the back of a drawer, along with paperwork from Enrique's time. That folder always felt like rummaging through a vault of memories. It smelled of old paper and lavender, from the sachets I placed to keep moths away. But now, it felt more like a vault of proof. These weren't memories. They were facts, records, ownership. And as strange as it seems, it didn't bring relief. It brought fear. Fear of how my family would react upon discovering that in practice, I owned the building where they treated me like a guest. I spent the rest of the afternoon in silence, just listening to the gate open, the children returning from school, the old elevators creaking as usual. Every sound seemed laden with meaning. I began to notice everything. The entrance rug I washed myself, the week before, the hallway light bulb I replaced with aching knees. It was as if, suddenly, I saw every small contribution that had gone unnoticed. And it hurt. It hurt more than any explicit disdain, because indifference is a kind of erasure no one teaches you to name. When Mauricio passed by me in the hallway that night, he only murmured "good evening," without looking me in the eye, and I replied as always, "Good evening, son." But inside me, my voice sounded different. There was a crack in it that, instead of breaking me, began to open me up. I didn't sleep well that night. I tossed and turned, wondering if it was worth dredging all that up, if it wouldn't be easier to stay silent, as always. But something inside me said, "You've waited long enough." The next morning, bright and early, I went to the bank. I took 2 buses to the main branch, the old one at Plaza Aníbal Pinto, which still has checkered floors and the smell of fresh paint on the furniture. I brought the letter, my ID, and asked to speak with someone in the real estate department. The clerk who attended me, a young woman with her hair in a bun and a sweet voice, confirmed everything. "Yes, Mrs. Aguilar, you are listed as the sole owner of the property since 1986. She even asked if I wanted to regularize the records or add an heir, and there I had the certainty. It was time to take the reins of my own story. I returned home with the blue folder pressed to my chest like a shield. I knew I didn't want confrontation or confusion, but I also knew I could no longer accept being called a burden in a place I built. So I took a deep breath, poured myself a strong coffee, put on my favorite gray sweater, the one Enrique loved, and knocked on Mauricio's apartment door. Daniela answered with a face that looked like she was expecting a request, but what she heard was something else. "I want to talk to both of you. Can it be now?" I asked, looking her in the eyes. Minutes later, we were seated at their table. They looked uncomfortable, as if expecting a lecture. But what I did was open the folder. I took out the copy of the deed and placed it on the table. "This building has been in my name for nearly 40 years. You think I'm a burden, but without me, you wouldn't even be here." The silence that followed was so heavy you could hear the fridge humming. Mauricio went pale. Daniela opened her mouth, then closed it again. I continued, "I never needed to shove this in anyone's face. But now, you've forced me, because it's not fair to see me as an expense when I'm the one who has always kept this standing, in silence, with dignity." For the first time, my son looked at me as if truly seeing me, and inside, I felt something I didn't know still existed. Respect. I didn't cry. I didn't shout. I just stood up, closed the folder calmly, and said, "From today on, I want this to be remembered, because I will no longer accept being invisible in what is mine." I left with slow but firm steps. For the first time in many years, I felt the entire building breathe with me, and that every brick of that story did indeed bear my name, even if until yesterday no one had noticed. That night, the house seemed to change temperature. I don't know if it was the winter cold or the disconcerting silence left between us. For the first time in years, no one invited me to dinner. Not even a plate was sent. But oddly, I didn't feel rejected. For the first time, it was a silence that welcomed me. A silence where I finally had a name. I ate what I had at home, a piece of bread with cheese and a boldo tea, and slept like someone who carries a key in her pocket, knowing that at any moment she can open the right door. The next morning, I ran into Mrs. Nelida in the lobby, the second-floor neighbor who had always been kind to me. She commented bluntly that she had overheard part of our conversation through the wall. "If I were you, I'd put your name on a brass plaque at the entrance, Teresa, because this building is yours, with all the letters." I smiled, a bit embarrassed, but it was there that I felt confirmation of what until then seemed only an inner movement. Someone saw me, and saw me as I truly was. I spent the week without saying another word. I didn't knock on their door. I didn't offer help, nor did I remove anything that was mine. Neither my affection for the grandchildren, nor the kindness of keeping the common areas clean. But I removed something deeper, the habit of diminishing myself to fit. And that, for me, was the greatest revolution. I began walking more upright in the corridors, leaving my door open as I used to when making coffee. And amazingly, the other residents began to stop more often to chat with me. Little by little, the building regained my scent, the smell of my hallway plants, of the recipes I tested in the kitchen, of the flowers I bought for the entrance with my own money, never asking for reimbursement. One day, the youngest grandchild showed up with a drawing. It was a colorful building, and at the top, a smiling lady holding a golden key. "That's you, Grandma," he said, and I couldn't hold back tears, because in that picture, I existed, and I existed just as I had always dreamed, recognized without having to shout. Mauricio, for his part, remained strange. He passed by me with more respect, but also guilt in his eyes. He didn't try to apologize, and perhaps he didn't even know how. Daniela walked more cautiously, as if treading on eggshells. I didn't want revenge. I just wanted the chance to exist fully. But I knew that from then on, our relationship would never be the same again. And strangely, it didn't hurt me. It relieved me. Because after so long living by small gestures and gigantic omissions, I finally felt I had returned to myself. A month later, I received another letter from the bank. This time, it was an invitation to update the property's records and formalize an individual ownership term. I went, alone, signed calmly, and requested an authenticated copy of the deed. I stored it in a new red folder, one of those modern ones. I left the lavender-scented blue folder intact, but I never touched it again, because now the story was within me. I no longer needed to prove anything to anyone. That same week, I decided to write a letter, not to them, but to myself. A letter that began, "Teresa, you endured more than you should have, and yet you didn't lose yourself." I wrote everything I never said, all the little moments of stifled pain, all the times I accepted the dirty plate, the indifference, the wait for affection that never came. And at the end, I signed with the same handwriting I used on the deed, firm, without trembling. I tucked the letter into the new folder, as if sealing a chapter. The following Sunday, I made a corn muffin and left it on the entrance table with a note, "For anyone who wants to remember what it feels like to be welcome." In less than an hour, the plate was empty. But what surprised me most was what I found in its place, a handwritten note with no signature, saying only, "Forgive me for calling you a burden. Today I understand that you upheld much more than walls." I folded the paper slowly, my hands still trembling, and placed it in the same envelope as the deed. Because that, yes, was proof that everything had changed. That Monday, when I went out to put the trash out, I noticed something different on the building's bulletin board. Someone, I don't know who, had pinned an old black and white photo of the building with a handwritten caption, "Since 1986, home to many stories. Thank you, Teresa." I stood there for a few seconds, not knowing what to feel. Part of me wanted to smile, the other wanted to hide, because it was strange, after so long being forgotten, to suddenly be remembered with affection. Upstairs, I sat in the living room armchair and looked out toward the balcony. It was drizzling, like it used to when Enrique came, home with fresh bread and the newspaper under his arm. I missed him. I missed how effortlessly he saw me. He used to say I was the hidden heart of things. At the time, I thought it was just a nice way of speaking. Today, I understand it was a profound truth, because we, women, sometimes become the foundation without even knowing we're holding up the whole structure. Late in the afternoon, I heard a timid knock at the door. It was Mauricio. His hands were in his pockets, shoulders slumped, and he looked like he'd traveled back in time. "May I come in?" he asked. I nodded without a word. He sat at the kitchen table, where the scent of fennel still lingered from the tea I'd just made. We sat in silence for a few minutes until he began. I said things I shouldn't have, and I know you were never a burden. It was me who got too comfortable in your presence. It wasn't a complete confession, not a redemption, but it was a beginning, and that, for me, was enough. I looked at him and said, "Only, I didn't need you to know everything. I just needed you to see me." He nodded, eyes moist. We didn't hug or go back to how we were, but I left knowing that something, however small, had been patched. And sometimes, a small patch is all we need to move forward without bleeding. In the days that followed, I continued my life more calmly. I stopped counting coins to justify myself. I bought new flowers for the entrance, had the railings repaired, and even painted my floor's windows. Some neighbors began asking my advice about building matters. They invited me to the next homeowners meeting, something they'd never done, and I accepted. Because now, I was no longer just the quiet lady on the third floor. I was Teresa Aguilar, owner, and that finally had a name and a face. Curiously, what changed most wasn't how they treated me, but how I treated myself. I began caring for myself as I did the building, patiently, with an eye for detail. I returned to walking by the seaside, as I used to with Enrique. I took the grandchildren for ice cream on Saturdays. I started writing letters to myself every week. Simple things, but together, they reminded me that I was still here, whole, present, alive. One morning, weeks later, I overheard Daniela commenting in the hallway that the building seemed lighter, more beautiful, better cared for. She said it not knowing I was there listening. I didn't respond. I just smiled inside, because deep down, I knew. The building was a mirror of what had changed in me. It was lighter because I was. It was more beautiful because I finally allowed myself to flourish there, without fear of taking up space. In the last letter I wrote to myself, I wrote a sentence I want to keep forever. It's never too late to reclaim your own name. And I signed with a dark blue pen, one of those old ones I'd kept since the cooperative days. Because there are things we don't lose. We just forget where we put them. And that day, I found everything I had ceased to be out of love, and that now returned out of self-love. Little by little, I understood that I no longer needed to justify my existence. Before, every time I used the elevator, I made sure to press the button silently so as not to disturb. Now, I ride with a firm, "Good morning," looking into the eyes of whoever is there. It's not arrogance, it's presence. A presence I had forgotten how to inhabit for years. And when I realized that, I felt as if my whole body was coming home. A home that was always mine, but that I had locked from the inside. There was one afternoon I'll never forget. I was sitting on the bench in the square in front of the building, my book in my lap, when a gentleman I'd never seen before approached and asked, "Are you the owner of the building across the street?" I answered yes, and he smiled. "You can tell by the way you look at it, as if it were part of the family." I choked up because it was true. That place was an extension of me, a piece of my story, and now I could look at it without shame for what I'd built. I also began talking more with other residents. People I only knew by sight began calling me by name. They asked how I was, if they needed help with anything. They included me in the building's group chat, and for the first time, my opinion was sought, not merely tolerated. It wasn't grand, but it was sincere, a recognition that came quietly, yet filled spaces that were once empty, and I filled those spaces with a new calm that only comes after pain that teaches. Mauricio remained quieter than usual, but there was more respect in his gestures. When I needed help with a faucet, he came up without me asking. He replaced the part, cleaned up, and said, "It's fixed, Mom." There was no emotion in his tone, but there was presence. And for me, at that moment, that was enough. I didn't want an endless apology. I just wanted him to stop seeing me as someone who weighed down, and to start realizing that perhaps I was the one, who supported him for longer than I should have. One night, as I read on the balcony, I heard the grandchildren talking among themselves. One said, "Grandma, you're the owner of the building, you know." And the other replied, "Really? So you're like, the boss?" They laughed, and my heart melted, because in that childlike simplicity, there was something no one else had said out loud. I was, indeed, the foundation of it all. And hearing that from those who matter most, the children, was like receiving an invisible medal. Those words gradually erased the cruel echo of financial burden. In the following months, many things changed. Not on the outside, but within me. I began writing small memoirs, things I lived with Enrique, with the little children, with old neighbors. I turned it all into a burgundy notebook I keep by my bedside. It made me feel good to remember that, even on days I was forgotten, I was always someone. And above all, I was always part of that place's story. A good, fundamental part. I had just let myself be convinced otherwise. I also returned to frequenting the municipal library. I discovered a reading club for women over 60. I joined in the first week, shyly, unsure if I still fit in with something new. But one meeting was enough to realize there were other Teresas there. Other women who, like me, had been forgotten within their own homes. Sharing our stories was like opening windows in a closed room for decades. Fresh air came in, and with it, the desire to continue living my way. One morning, as I went downstairs to get bread, I ran into Daniela in the lobby. She greeted me with a discreet smile and said, "Thank you for not yelling that day." I would have yelled. I replied that everyone reacts as they can, and that I, at that moment, could only show the deed. But deep down, what I wanted to show was something else, my dignity, because it was never written. It was in how I insisted on remaining whole, even when everything around tried to make me disappear. I thought a lot after that conversation with Daniela. Sometimes what hurts most isn't what's said to us directly, but what's said when they think we're not listening. That phrase, "she's a financial burden," still visits my memory now and then, like a cold drop falling in silence. But over time, it lost its weight, because now, every time it tried to return, I remembered the deed, the anonymous note, the photo on the bulletin board, and above all, the woman I became again after that day. Curiously, I didn't need to shout or seek revenge to be heard. I used documents, presence, and truth. That taught me something I will never forget. When you know your own worth, you no longer have to beg for respect. It comes, sometimes slowly, sometimes with discomfort, but it comes. And if it doesn't, you learn to move forward without it. Because the respect that truly sustains isn't from others. It's our own, for ourselves. There was a Sunday when I made empanadas for the residents. I left them in the lobby with a decorative napkin and a note, "Made with love by Teresa." The meat one has chili. In minutes, none remained. And in that simple gesture, I felt I returned to being part of the building, not as a shadow, but as a living presence. Someone thanked me from afar. "Mrs. Teresa, they were delicious." I smiled and replied, "The secret is to make them slowly, like everything that lasts." And in that instant, I understood I was like those empanadas, made slowly, with substance and memory. I began opening my door more often. I hosted some neighbors for tea. We talked about everything, from the peeling tiles to childhood memories we didn't even know we still kept. We laughed, cried, and exchanged recipes. I realized I had much more to offer than I thought, that my story, even with its painful folds, could serve as a bridge. And it was there, over buttery biscuits, that I discovered my place wasn't to wait, it was to be present. Mauricio, over time, began coming downstairs more often with the boys. One day, he brought them to help me care for the entrance plants. "Grandma knows about these things," he said. It was the first time he called me Grandma out loud, in front of the children, since that incident. It was a small gesture, but full of meaning. I continued watering the flowers as if nothing had happened. But inside, my chest expanded like a house with freshly opened windows. That same week, I received a call from the old cooperative where I used to work. A colleague from back then, Carmen, had found an old letter of mine, one of those you write to yourself during year-end training. She read it aloud. "In 20 years, I hope to be living in a place where I'm felt part of, even if not said out loud." I hung up with tears in my eyes, because without realizing, I had returned exactly to that place. Only now, with a voice, and with my name on the wall. I decided to frame that old deed. I put it in a simple frame with frosted glass, and hung it behind my living room door. It's not for display, it's to remind that nothing I lived was small, that every silence, every concession, every choice was also a brick in that building, a building that stands only because, one day, A silent woman decided not to give in anymore, and she did it without shouting, simply by being whole at last. And even if no one else comments on it, I know everyone noticed. The way they greet me, how they call me by name, how they seek my opinion at meetings. None of that existed before. Not because they couldn't see me, but because I had accepted being invisible. And you only realize that when you return, when you reclaim your own space, when you stop asking permission to exist, and simply begin occupying what was always yours. The other day, I sat alone on the building's rooftop, where almost no one goes. I brought a folding chair, a scarf around my neck, and a notebook in hand. The sky was clear, and I could see ships in the distance, crossing Valparaiso's sea, as if carrying stories similar to mine. I began writing what I called my invisible inventory. I noted everything I offered to that place without anyone seeing. The times I cleaned the stairs when it wasn't my turn, the days I paid the water bill without complaint, the toys I repaired for my grandchildren without them noticing. Line by line, I was recognizing myself. When I came down, it felt as if something inside me had shifted, a kind of internal reorganization, as if each memory returned to its rightful place. I opened my apartment door, made a cinnamon tea, and sat in the armchair overlooking the courtyard. I was at peace. Not the resigned peace, but a peace that comes when you reconnect with yourself after being lost for so long. I was whole. Finally, the following week, something curious happened. The building's superintendent, Mr. Alfredo, asked to speak with me. He said he was thinking of retiring and wanted to know if I would consider taking over his position. No one knows this building better than you, Mrs. Teresa, and I think it feels that way too. That moved me more than I can explain. It wasn't about the title. It was about recognition, about finally occupying the space that was always mine, with name, with affection, with truth. I asked for a few days to think, not out of insecurity, but out of respect. I wanted to be sure I'd accept it of my own will, not to prove anything to anyone. I talked to myself, reread my letters, walked the corridors, and then, on Friday, I knocked on Alfredo's door and said, "I accept, but I want to do it my way, a way that sees people, listens to silences." He smiled. "That's exactly why I asked for you." And in that handshake, something inside me settled for good. Taking on the superintendent's role was symbolic. I began organizing repairs, bills, meetings, but also conversations, shared coffees, residents' birthdays. I created a bulletin board of old stories with photos from when the building still smelled of fresh paint. I asked each resident to leave a memory there, and among the notes, I received one from Daniela. It read, "Thank you for teaching us with silence and resolve. You changed the building, and us too." I kept that note in the red folder, next to the deed, because everything there was part of the same turning point. Today, people call me by my full name, Teresa Aguilar. Some even ask how I managed to maintain all that for so long without saying a word. And I answer what I now know with all the letters. We endure until we shouldn't, but one day we come back. And when we do, we don't come halfway. And when I say that, I feel my voice no longer tremble, because it doesn't come only from my throat. It comes from the whole story I carried to this point. I don't know how long I'll stay in this building. Age imposes its limits, and my body no longer keeps up like before. But I know that as long as I'm here, I will continue watering the plants, organizing the accounts, and writing my letters, because now I know my presence isn't a favor, nor charity, nor a burden. It's a root, and when a root takes hold, it sustains even the most cracked walls. The most beautiful thing about all this is that I didn't have to shout, threaten, or fight to be heard. I just had to remember who I was and let others see me too. And today, every time someone calls me, asks for my opinion, or hands me a piece of cake on a napkin, I think maybe that's the sound of justice. Not the kind that hurts, but the kind that finally reaches what was hidden for too long. Another habit I recovered was lighting a small candle by the window at the end of each day, not out of religion, but out of gratitude. Enrique used to do that in our early years of marriage as an evening ritual. And now, whenever I see that flickering flame against the dusk light, I feel as if he's nearby, whispering, "You did it, Terry. Your way." It may be a silly gesture, but to me it's a way of stitching the days together with meaning. There are things only solitude allows you to see. I never wished to be alone, but I acknowledge it was in that silence that I rediscovered my strength. And it was also there I learned not to accept less than I deserve. I spent a lifetime bending, trying to be useful, discreet, invisible. Not anymore. I did not become harsh or bitter, just firm. Firm like the gate that creaks every time someone enters, and which I now know is also mine. Over time, even the children started calling me affectionately. "Mrs. Tay?" they shout from the courtyard when they see me on the balcony. I wave, blow kisses, and go back inside with a warmed heart. It's curious how true affection appears when you stop begging for attention. When I began treating myself with respect, it was as if I taught others how to do the same. And maybe that's the greatest lesson I've learned. We teach the world to see us by how we see ourselves. The funniest thing is, I never wanted to own anything. Not the building, not the superintendent's title, not the respect they now gradually show me. I just wanted to belong, to feel that my presence mattered. And when I stopped trying to prove that, and simply was who I am, Teresa, widow, retiree, silent but firm, everything fell into place. Not perfectly, but as possible. And in the real world, that's already a lot. Maurizio still lives on the first floor. Sometimes he's still curt, other times kinder. I no longer expect from him what he perhaps doesn't know how to give. But I feel he sees me differently, with more care, with more reverence perhaps. And that's enough. The wound hasn't disappeared, but it stopped hurting. It became a scar. And a scar, contrary to what they say, is a sign of victory, not weakness. Today, the building is more alive than ever. The lights work, the walls have been painted, neighbors greet each other more often. And I know all this has to do with what began that day I heard my son call me a financial burden, and instead of breaking down, went to fetch the deed he never imagined existed. It was that document, kept in silence for so long, that reminded me who I was, and that I was never a burden. I was the foundation. Perhaps what moves me most is thinking that many other women may be living the same right now. Silent, invisible, full of value without recognition. That's why I decided to write all this. Not to expose anyone, but to remind that there are ways to reclaim your place, without destroying others. Sometimes it's enough to put your own name back in the story, even if it starts with an old envelope, hidden at the bottom of a drawer. And if you who are reading have ever felt erased, used, or diminished within your own home, know this: you are not alone. Sometimes we just need a nudge to remember how much we've built. And if no one else says it, I'll say it now. You are worth it. You have done more than credit was given. And when you decide to stand up, you will realize that the key, the door, and the home have always been yours. This last spring, I planted daisies in the entrance flower bed. It was something I always wanted to do but never felt entitled to. I thought they'd complain, that they'd call it too much. But now I know, if I want to leave beauty where I go, I don't need permission. And every time someone enters and comments on how lovely it looks, I smile. I don't say I planted them, but I know, and that's enough. Because not every contribution needs a plaque. Some only need soil and courage. Sometimes they ask me if I regret not telling them about the deed sooner, and my answer is, I don't know. Maybe if I had told them, I would have avoided that cruel day, but maybe I wouldn't have learned everything I learned in the silence, because it was the silence that made me look at myself, that made the pain grow until it became strength. Sometimes things need the right time to happen, and for me, the right time arrived in that very moment, when it seemed too late, but was the perfect instant. I bought a simple recorder and began recording my voice recounting these memories. I don't know if anyone will ever hear them, but it gives me a strange comfort to know that even if my presence fades, my voice will remain. It's like leaving a message for a future Teresa, or for any woman who, like me, has forgotten how capable she is. I speak simply, as I am speaking here, as one speaks to a friend, because deep down, that's what we need most, to be heard without judgment. The most symbolic thing happened without planning. A group of neighborhood youths decided to hold a small exhibition about the neighborhood's history. They asked for old photos, objects, stories. A neighbor told them about me. They came to my house to record a testimony. At first, I hesitated, but then I thought, if I spent my life silent, perhaps it's time to leave my version on record. And when I finished speaking, one of the boys said, "You are this place's living memory." I choked up, thanked them, and tucked that phrase into a corner of my soul. One day, the grandchildren were playing in the courtyard, and one of them pointed to the building and said, "This is Grandma's house, but it's everyone's house, right?" I found it beautiful how he understood that, because that's exactly how I feel today. I don't need everything to be mine to belong, but I no longer accept being a guest in something I helped build. Today, I walk these corridors with firm steps, because I know each tile has a piece of me. Enrique always said dignity was like a building structure, invisible, but essential. And now I understand what he meant. For a long time, my structure wobbled. I thought it would collapse, but I stayed there, sustaining everything without being seen. Now, even if no one sees it, I know. My dignity is whole, and it is the foundation of everything I've become. At the last homeowners meeting, I asked for the floor and thanked everyone for trusting me to care for the building. I said it wasn't just a role. It was a silent repair of something that had been crooked for too long. Some people applauded. Others lowered their eyes, perhaps in shame or regret. But I no longer needed approval. I just wanted to make it clear that, from now on, I would no longer disappear in the name of peace. I exist, and now, with name, with voice, and with story. Before leaving the room, one of the oldest residents stopped me and said, "Teresa, you don't just care for the building, you care for our collective memory." That pierced me, because it was that. My way of existing has always been this, discreet but firm, and now, at last, recognized. I returned home that night with a flutter in my chest. It wasn't sadness, it was gratitude. Gratitude for having stayed, for having endured, for having chosen, that day, not to let one sentence define me. Another gesture that became a habit was placing dried flowers inside the books on my shelf. Each represents a moment of this new beginning. The first, a daisy, was from the day I opened the blue folder after so many years. The second, a lavender sprig, was from the day I hung the deed on the wall, and so I marked the chapters of my own story, as if each flower sealed a learned lesson. One day, someone may find these books and understand that even an ordinary life carries small miracles, if you know how to look. The letters I continue writing to myself now fill an entire drawer. I don't keep only big events. I write about the smell of warm bread from the bakery, the rain beating against the glass, the way my grandchildren hug me when they come home from school. I write to remind myself I exist in the details. And because I've learned that nothing is more precious than knowing how to listen to yourself, perhaps that is the greatest gift of maturity, realizing that, even alone, you can be your best company. Another day I received an unexpected visitor, Daniela's mother. We'd never spoken beyond formal greetings. She came to my kitchen with a shy smile, bringing a jar of homemade jelly. We sat, and little by little she opened up. She said she felt ashamed by how her daughter treated me, that she recognized in me a strength her own family often ignored. I didn't expect that, but I accepted it, because understanding that someone sees your pain, even belatedly, is also a form of healing. I began thinking more about what I leave behind in this world. I don't mean possessions, deeds, objects. I mean presence, emotional imprints. I mean how my story intertwines with others. I discovered the legacy I want isn't the building itself, but how I held its walls up even when disbelieved, how I chose to stay, even when everything pushed me aside, and above all, how I finally chose to occupy the center. I started wearing red lipstick again. It may seem trivial, but for many years I thought lipstick drew too much attention, and I didn't want to be seen. Now I wear it with pride. It's my small late rebellion, a way of saying, I'm here, alive, present, and if it bothers, too bad. I no longer hide. Each wrinkle on my face is a line in the book I wrote with my body, and that book no longer needs to be kept secret. Sometimes I still recall the day I heard that phrase behind the door, "She's a financial burden," and every time that memory visits, I receive it as one would an old scar. It doesn't hurt anymore, but I don't forget, because it was that which pushed me back, to myself. It was that which unwittingly ignited the spark of change, and as cruel as it was, it also marked everything that came after. Today, the building is no longer just my physical place. It's a living metaphor for who I've become, full of marks, cracks, repairs, but steadfast, full of life pulsing in every corner. When I look out the window and see children running, neighbors chatting in the lobby, flowers budding at the entrance, I think it was worth it, even the years of silence, even the hidden tears, because all this brought me here. And here, at last, I belong. I close this story with one last image. An ordinary morning, sunlight streaming through the balcony, the smell of coffee mingling with that of watered plants, and me, seated at the table with my notebook, my blue pen, and my head held high. I no longer expect applause. I have nothing more to prove. I just write, because writing, for me, is ensuring my story will no longer be silent. And if someone, somewhere, recognizes herself in it, then it was already worth living all that I lived. In recent days, I've begun waking up earlier. I like to see the building wake with me. The windows opening, hurried footsteps in the corridor, the smell of first coffee slipping through doors. Sometimes I realize I spent all those years experiencing it without feeling part of it. It was like watching a movie through a window without a ticket. Not anymore. Now I belong to the scene. I am one of the voices composing the soundtrack of these mornings. And that gives me a peace I wouldn't trade for anything. Another habit I adopted was writing what I call memories of silence. They're not facts. They're sensations. Those moments when there were no words, but something inside me shifted. Like the day I was called a burden, or the moment I looked at the deed and felt my name weigh differently on paper, or the first time I rode the elevator without shrinking. Those memories are hard to explain, but precious, because it was in them I rediscovered my existence. I returned to handling Enrique's things, not with pain, but with care. I found old letters, forgotten photographs, even a coin he carried as a lucky charm. I reorganized everything in a box I now leave on a high shelf. It was he who taught me never to depend on others' recognition to know my worth. And, in some way, it's as if he's still here, silently proud of what I've become. One of those afternoons, I sat with the grandchildren to assemble a puzzle. They're restless, talkative, they argue and make up in minutes. But that day, they were calmer, and suddenly, one looked at me and said, "Grandma, you're the boss here, right?" I laughed. "I'm not the boss, dear. I take care." He thought for a moment and replied, "So it's like being a queen." And at that moment, I understood that in their eyes, I was never a burden. I was, and am, a foundation, a guide, a presence, a queen, perhaps, but a queen without a crown, calloused hands, in an apron and with... I began sharing excerpts of my writings at the reading club. At first I was embarrassed. I thought they'd call it exaggeration, old lady drama, but the reaction was the opposite. They listened in silence. Some cried, others hugged me afterward. One lady said, "You told my story, Teresa, only I haven't found my deed yet." And it was then I realized my voice could serve others, not as a template, but as a mirror, a clear mirror where other women could recognize themselves without fear. I was invited to speak at a local school about memory and belonging. I was surprised. I said I wasn't a lecturer or an expert, but they insisted. So I went, and I told my story as I'm telling it here. No embellishments, no heroism, just the truth. When I finished, a girl asked, "Mrs. Teresa, what would you have done differently if you'd started seeing yourself earlier?" I thought for a moment and replied, "Maybe I would have loved myself as much as I loved others." Each passing day, collect little reminders that I'm on the right path. A flower left at my door, an anonymous note thanking me for caring for the garden, a somewhat longer wave in the elevator. They're not grand gestures, but they're real. And after a lifetime accepting being a shadow, those flashes of light are enough. Because now I know, it's not necessary for everyone to see. It's enough that I no longer hide. I approach my 72nd year with more strength than I had at 40. Not physical strength. Time takes that. But strength of soul, of conviction, of knowing who I am, where I belong, and what I no longer accept. And that's why I go on. I go on with my notebooks, my letters, my firm steps through corridors I once wandered bent. And above all, I go on with my head held high, because everything I've achieved since that day wasn't a gift or luck. It was justice. Recently, I decided to renovate my apartment. Nothing extravagant, just small changes that make a difference. I painted the walls a soft yellow, replaced the curtains, bought a floral tablecloth. I wanted to leave the space reflecting me, or rather, reflecting the me I rediscovered over this time. It's as if every detail says, this house has an owner, this story has a protagonist, not out of vanity, out of respect. A respect that, before coming from others, came from me. One of my favorite things now is cooking on Sundays. I leave the door ajar, and the smell of food drifts down the hallway. Sometimes a neighbor knocks to ask for a slice of pie. Other times the grandchildren come running, drawn by the scent of freshly baked bread. Those moments make me realize how simple life can be, and still profoundly meaningful. It's not about being celebrated. It's about being felt, shared, remembered. There was an afternoon when I sat with Mauricio on the balcony. He seemed lighter. We talked about the boys, about time, about nothing very important. And then, almost as if letting it slip, he said, "I wish I had seen you sooner, Mom." I didn't respond immediately. I took his hand, so similar to his father's, and simply said, "Now you see me, and that's enough." I don't know if he understood everything those words carried, but at that instant, the distance between us grew a little smaller. With Daniela, our relationship remains cordial. We're not close, and perhaps we never will be, but there's respect, and that, for me, is enough. Sometimes we exchange recipes. Other times, it's just a nod in the hallway. I've learned not to force closeness that doesn't arise naturally. I've also learned that kindness doesn't need reciprocity to be valuable. It is, in itself, a gesture of freedom. Homeowners' meetings have become more participatory. Now everyone has a voice, even the quietest. I make a point of listening carefully, because I know what it's like to have something to say and never be heard. The building is more alive, more united, and in a way, more mine than ever. Not because I possess it on paper, but because I stopped asking permission to truly inhabit it. Some younger residents ask me for advice on matters beyond building management. They speak of family conflicts, of doubts about aging, of coping with invisibility. I don't have ready answers, but I offer listening, and sometimes that alone is enough, because as I learned, being seen starts within, and listening to another is a way to help someone see themselves too. The other day, I walked up to the top of Cerro Alegre again. It had been a while since I climbed that path. The port view, the smell of the sea, the wind on my face, everything reminded me of young Teresa, who arrived in Valparaiso in a simple dress with big dreams. I thought of how long she waited for validation, and I smiled, because now, if I could speak to her, I'd say, "It will take you time to realize, but you already have everything you need. You only have to trust." And so I keep living, with more silence than before, but with much more presence. I care for the plants, write my notebooks, collect smiles, and each new day that dawns is another chance to affirm to myself, I stayed, I resisted, and I made it count. Not only with documents, but with dignity, because the true deed that belongs to me is of the soul. Some nights, I sit on the balcony with a blanket over my legs and just listen to the building fall asleep. Doors closing slowly, water running through pipes, a distant radio playing Bolero on the third floor. And there, in that half-light, I think of all I endured without ever imagining my story would be told with pride, not out of vanity, but out of justice. Because when someone is erased within their own home, telling their story is a way to exist again. Sometimes I still ask myself, what if I had never heard that phrase? What if the bank had never sent that letter? Would I have remained just a forgotten name on the intercom? Maybe yes, maybe no. But I learned that even the greatest shocks come with purpose, that even blows have cracks through which light enters, and that, even when everything seems to crumble, there still exists within us an ancient strength, silent but unbreakable, ready to rise. The other day, I passed the concierge desk and saw a new resident moving in. She had boxes, small children, and an exhausted expression. I introduced myself, offered to help with the elevators, and that afternoon left a homemade loaf of bread at her door. No note, no signature, just to say, you're not alone. Because now, more than superintendent, neighbor, or owner, I am someone who knows the value of being welcomed, and I want to spread that gesture, the simplest, the strongest. I made peace with the past, not with everything, but with enough. I accepted that not everyone will apologize to me, and that not every silence is injustice. Sometimes it's just someone who doesn't know how to repair what's broken, and that's okay. I no longer live waiting for reparations. I live building new foundations, and whenever possible, inviting others to climb up with me. I wrote my last letter to myself on the day I turned 72. In it, I wrote only one sentence. Teresa, now you are home. And with that, I closed the red notebook. Not because the story ended, but because I no longer need to write it down to remember who I am. Now, each gesture of mine is a continuation. Each step is testimony. Each breath is permanence. The building remains the same on the outside, but inside, everything changed. Not only the walls, but relationships. The way people greet each other. The way children run freely. The way elderly ladies sit together to chat at dusk. And when someone asks what happened here, I say, we learned to see what was always in front of us, including me. So, if you've listened to me this far, I can only thank you. Because telling this story was not easy, but it was necessary. I needed to remember, and perhaps you do too, that it's never too late to reclaim your place. It's never too early to plant your presence. And even if the world treats you like a burden, you can be the foundation that sustains everything. Silent, firm, and finally visible. This is me, Teresa Aguilar, widow, mother, neighbor, superintendent, keeper of memories, and, above all, owner of myself. It took time, but I came home. And now, no one can take me away. Sometimes life keeps us silent for so long that we start to doubt if we still have a voice. And when we finally find the strength to say, I am here, the world seems to listen differently. Maybe you felt that way too. Erased, forgotten, as if your presence weighed more than it was worth. If so, I just want to say, you are not alone. Tell me in the comments if any part of this story spoke to you. Sometimes sharing what we feel is the most beautiful way to come back into existence with strength. And if you know someone who's been too quiet, thinking they no longer have a place in the world, share this video with care. Sometimes one story is enough to remind someone of what they never stopped being. If you want to keep hearing stories from those who also lived the invisible and had the courage to return to themselves, stay here with us. There are many stories waiting to be told with the same care. Thank you for staying until the end. May your voice never need to hide again.